So, what is it? 109 years ago today, the landings at Gallipoli took place. This is not an image I have in my own archives. It's a Cuneo painting. Um, I wish I had it on my walls. It shows Gurkhas scrambling up the beaches at Gallipoli in 1915 with battleships in the background. Kind of a good representation of a typical early battle at Gallipoli during the landings on this day in 1915. And I just want to kind of set a little bit of context to start off with first, as usual, trying to get the buttons to work. So, the Gallipoli campaign, the kind of roots to the Gallipoli campaign begin with a naval operation because Gallipoli is a peninsula jutting out into the Aegean Sea, with the Dardanelles, the waterway that separates European Turkey from Asiatic Turkey today, and leads into the Sea of Marmara and onwards to what was then Constantinople and Istanbul, and beyond that the Black Sea. There's all kinds of complicated reasons behind the operations at Gallipoli. Turkey was a nation that joined the war with alongside the powers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, and led to Turkey becoming an enemy of Great Britain and the wider empire, and France as well, and threatening interests of all those nations in this region, with blocking off access into the Black Sea. And it was felt that a significant naval presence from the Royal Navy and the French Navy would be enough to kind of steam up the Dardanelles, fire a few shots, and then land small naval force, Royal Marines or whatever, and French naval marines at Constantinople, game over. Britain and France significantly underestimated the Turks, significantly underestimated the Turkish defences in the Dardanelles, which consisted not just of mines and submarines that were active there, but also the Turkish gun batteries that had very, very heavy firepower, were highly trained, and their weapons incredibly accurate against these massive ships from both Britain and France that steamed down the Dardanelles, resulting in quite a number of them being sunk in that action, and a realization that a naval operation would not be successful in any kind of way, any meaningful way, with getting to Constantinople. So the Navy had to accept this and go to the army with the backing, of course, of Winston Churchill behind them, who was Lord of the Admiralty, and who was one of several who believed there were other ways to win the war on other fronts rather than the Western Front. So the Navy went to the army, and the army wasn't really that interested in Gallipoli in many respects, but it handed over a number of formations that it had in its back pocket, if you like, that at that point were probably being considered for the Western Front, but were not quite ready for it, or that the army thought they could spare them. I'm not saying the army handed them loose change, but it was units that on the whole had not had any kind of combat experience in this recent war. The 29th Division, which was one of the British divisions, is slightly different in that some of its units had fought in a equally kind of complex battle in some ways with the Japanese in China against the Germans at Tsingtao. And that's perhaps a story, as we often say on the podcast, for another day. But generally, these were these were units that had no combat experience. So amongst them were British formations, Indian formations, the Royal Naval Division, which had served at Antwerp in 1914 and then reformed at Blandford Camp in Dorset and come to Egypt, and will be used as part of the force here, kind of giving a naval slant to the ground operations, comprised of Royal Marines and Royal Naval Volunteer reservists, and a number of other British formations, and of course the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, which is a combination of the then recruited Australian Imperial Force battalions and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force battalions that had been put together into formations that kind of didn't quite make up an entire normal-sized army corps, but it was enough to kind of put those two forces together, which wasn't always popular with either side. So that led to the idea of a proper military operation, which would not try and force the narrows of going up the Dardanelles that we see in this image, but landing, and this is taken from the Graphic, which is a wartime newspaper, showing the Gallipoli Peninsula again and showing the coastline where landings took place. Now, they didn't land everywhere. They landed on the southern part of this peninsula and on the southwestern part of it, and then up towards the northern area, which is where the Australians and New Zealanders were going to land. The idea was to land, get ashore, move inland, get onto the road systems, advance up the coast with the Sea of Marmara on your right, and then arrive at Constantinople, fire a few shots, pop off a few bits of artillery, and again, somehow they thought the Turks would surrender. I mean, that's a very simplistic kind of overview of the plan, but that is essentially what they hoped. It was never going to happen. And even if they got off the peninsula on the first day, if any of you have been to Gallipoli, and even if you haven't, the terrain between Gallipoli and Constantinople is very similar to the Sussex Downs. It's very rolling downland. So there's kind of ridge after ridge after ridge to defend. So even if the Allies, the French and the British, supported by their navy, had got off this peninsula in those early days of the operation, they never, in my mind, would ever have got to Constantinople, to Istanbul, because A, they had the might of the Turkish army standing in their way, which they greatly underestimated, and B, the terrain was not in their favour, and they would have had a massive logistics trail behind them that I think would have been impossible to ever sustain. So it was a doomed expedition in my mind from the very beginning. And it is a place today that is a place of great beauty, tranquility. The cemeteries are really quite amazing. They're very different to the cemeteries on the Western Front, but is a place forever kind of that has a darkness over it, considering the sadness and the tragedy that unfolded with the terrible losses on both sides here in 1915. So that's kind of a little bit of history behind it. At the end of the campaign, from a British and Commonwealth point of view, there were 220,000 casualties, which was nearly 50% of those who took part in the Gallipoli campaign. So it was a failure. 9 months of operations from the landings on this day in 1915 to the evacuation, the final evacuation on Cape Helles in January of 1916. So let's get kind of down to some detail. These are from, now I do have these maps because these are from the official history volumes. There's some very nice maps in the map volume pockets for the 1915 official history volumes for Gallipoli. There's 2 separate volumes for that. And this shows ANZAC Cove, Brighton Beach, basically ANZAC generally, where the Australians landed on this day in 1915, with the New Zealanders further to the north. The idea was to land, push right up into the high ground. You can see these kind of brown contour lines on the map. That's the high ground above. But the terrain, the lack of decent maps, being landed in the wrong place, which was what happened, plus the tenacity of Turks to defend this ground and lack of communication, clear kind of knowledge of what really was going to be done if they got up to some of these points, meant that the whole battle kind of broke down. And what we're looking at here is a trench map, essentially showing the high tide mark of Australian and New Zealand soldiers just coming off of ANZAC right through the rest of the campaign. So you can see they never got really very far from the actual beaches. And while the operations continued here from the April landings through to the final evacuations in this area in December of 1915, and there were significant battles, particularly around Lone Pine, which is in the kind of central part of this map, and the advance with Australian Light Horse on the neck and near Baby 700. This was a battlefield that turned into really a kind of replicant of the Western Front. Static warfare, trench warfare. There was gas used here. There was even mining. And it wasn't really any different to what was happening on the Western Front. So Churchill's vainglory of trying to seek a second front and achieve victory through it proved to be just that, vainglory. So let's go down to some photographs, and these are a few portrait photographs of guys that I've picked up over the years in those days when there were these amazing junk shops tucked away in places like Sussex. And this one actually came from a junk shop in Sussex. It's a photograph of Sergeant Simons. He signed it, Fred Simons, on the back of the card. And he served with the 14th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, which was Jacka's Mob. It wasn't known as Jacka's Mob on the 25th of April 1915, although Jacka was with them. He would become the first Australian soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross at Gallipoli, just a few weeks after the initial landings. But Simon served alongside him, and he was typical of many of the men who served in the original AIF that landed at Gallipoli. A veteran of the Boer War. We can see his ribbons on the uniform that he's wearing, just above his tunic pocket. Queen South Africa medal and the King South Africa medal. And I think there's a coronation medal in there as well, if I remember correctly, in his case. And he was born in Britain, which quite a percentage, I think something nearly 30% of the original diggers that landed at Gallipoli were born in Great Britain, which was not untypical of most empire Commonwealth nations then, who had a huge amount of immigration from Britain to them in the years before the Great War. Less so in New Zealand. It was a much older process, and less than Canada in Australia, but Australians, nevertheless, it was a young nation. And many of them, you kind of read some of the literature, they don't even really identify sometimes as Australian. They identify as New South Walians or Victorians or whatever it is. It was that young a nation really in 1915, which is why this was such a significant event in their history. So Sergeant Simons was in Jacka's Mob, 14th Battalion, came in one of the follow-up waves. This is Lieutenant Hampton of the Australian Light Horse. They left their horses behind, I think, on Mudros, one of the islands in the Aegean, and they came in as mounted infantry, basically as dismounted cavalry, and would play a very significant role in the operations after the landing, in the fighting around the neck. And he went on to serve both at Gallipoli and later on in Palestine. And I think he finished with the Camel Corps in the last phase of the war, which was a formation that was used extensively in the Desert War in Palestine, Gaza, and places like that in the final phase of the war in the Middle East. Another man of Gallipoli. And this chap, sadly, I don't know his name. It's a later photograph. So both those pictures we just saw were taken before Gallipoli. This one was taken a while after Gallipoli. He's an unidentified 1st Australian Division soldier, sergeant, warrant officer. Depending on when this is taken, he might be a quartermaster. But what's significant, and I'm not sure if it's 100% visible on your screens, but on his patch is a brass A, and they were given to Australian soldiers who'd served at ANZAC. It was a kind of notification, a tribute almost to the fact that they were Gallipoli veterans, and they proudly wore those brass A's on their unit flash to indicate that they had served at Gallipoli in 1915. So he's an unknown Gallipoli veteran, and this image, I would guess, is probably taken 1917, 18, something like that. So 3 faces of 3 men who served at Gallipoli on this day in the original landings in 1915, and we'll see a few more kind of pictures like this as we go on. So that's our Australian friends, and this is a private photograph that was turned into a postcard. And as I understand it, afterwards in Egypt, a lot of Australian soldiers could buy these as souvenirs. They were sold to them. Quite who sold them, I don't know, but they were on sale. And I've seen a few different variations of this, but it's a private photograph turned into a postcard with a caption, and it shows ANZAC, the Brighton Beach to the kind of southern end of the Australian landing area. And it kind of gives you an idea how narrow the beach was at high tide. This is early on in the campaign. The kind of infrastructure in the cliffs, the sides of the beach isn't entirely in place. And men are kind of freely swimming in the water there, which as the campaign went on and the Turks bombarded these kind of positions more and more, that was more and more fraught with danger. And we can see some of the ships out to sea, giving us an idea how there was an ever presence of the Navy, whether it was supporting it by giving naval gunfire to some of the attacks or sending in supplies or new reinforcements. And the Turks had submarines operating out there. You can see a ship on its side in the water, There was a number of ships just off of ANZAC and Cape Helles that were sunk by submarines, or mines that were laid into the water there. So it was not, it was a unique campaign in that respect, where an army was placed on a shore, fought in a narrow area, and was protected and served and supplied by the Navy. Kind of a blueprint for future amphibious operations, perhaps not quite how to do it, that kind of blueprint. Something that we, myself, and I know John's listening tonight, we worked with John on a program called Gallipoli, the First D-Day, many years ago, which you can find on YouTube. It's there to watch. So we can't forget our New Zealand friends, and this is a photograph of the men of the Canterbury Regiment New Zealand Expeditionary Force, taken sometime towards the end of their training, probably just before they proceeded overseas. And this is the same company that Michael Palin's relative, his great uncle, was serving in. I did send this to Michael, and in the end it didn't make his book because he couldn't identify which one was Harry Palin, but it kind of connects us to that story. And if you're not familiar with that story, it's the subject of Michael Palin's new book, which kind of follows his story from Gallipoli through to his death on the Somme in 1916. But these, you're looking into this picture, looking into the faces of New Zealanders who landed on this day in 1915, and they came ashore on the northern part of the ANZAC area and moved inland. It's quite easy to see where they were. There's a Canterbury cemetery on the beach there today, and the New Zealand outpost cemeteries very close to where the New Zealanders landed in this operation. And for both these nations, for Australia and New Zealand being self-governing dominions by this stage, this was a really important chapter in their history. This is kind of where they stepped onto a world stage. It wasn't the first page of their history, particularly in New Zealand with the history of the Maoris, but this was a turning point in both these countries' history, which is why the obsession with it continues to this day, understandably. And then, of course, we go down to the southern part of the Gallipoli area, Cape Helles, where the British landed on several beaches. And one of the famous ones was W Beach. They were given letters, the beaches there, W, V, S, and Y Beach. And this is a later illustration based on an original one of the period, showing the landing of the Lancashire Fusiliers at W Beach, which became known as Lancashire Landing, when, according to the history, according to the famous saying, 6 VCs were won before breakfast. It kind of wasn't as simple as that, but 6 acts of bravery were subsequently awarded Victoria Crosses by a ballot as well. So it was so there was a kind of a vote on it to a certain degree. So it was an unusual incident in the history of the British Army and indeed of the First World War. I think this and Zeebrugge, which is also another amphibious operation, were 2 examples of this system of recommendation operating, which was different to the norm, where recommendations had to come in from officers for them to be ratified. But this is a particular connection to me because my grandfather, who was Bertie Samuel Reed, was a stoker on HMS Implacable, and he spent his time, most of the time, in the depths of that ship, shoveling the coal to get it from A to B. And when naval operations were planned, it wasn't uncommon for them to go below decks to ask for volunteers, so they could come out of the darkness and be in the light. And whatever prompted my grandfather to volunteer, he volunteered, and he ended up in a rowing boat rowing in one part of the Lancashire Fusiliers. And I never met him. He died. He had emphysema because of working with the coal in the boiler rooms. He died in the 50s. But my dad had remembered, as a boy, hearing these stories of landing the Lancashire Fusiliers and the blood and the sea rather running red with the blood of the Lancashire Fusiliers as they came in on their boats. There's no landing craft at Gallipoli to climb up out of quite high level rowing boats, jump into the water. So often jumping 3 or 4 or more foot into the water. There was wire in the water. Soldiers got caught on the wire in the water, and it kind of ripped open their arms and their legs and their chests, and blood was running kind of everywhere. That was the kind of typical scene of it. And that was his kind of enduring memory of this. And when my dad was volunteered for military, well, when he was conscripted rather for military service in 1938 after the German invasion of the Sudetenland, which was pre-registration of people in for a war that everyone knew was about to come. My grandfather tried to persuade him to make sure he went in the Navy and not the Army, because he'd seen what had happened to lads who went into the Army. But my dad didn't have any choice, and he ended up, my grandfather having served in an amphibious operation in the Great War at Gallipoli. My dad served in an amphibious operation, Anzio, which has got kind of shadows of Gallipoli going across it in World War II in the Italian campaign. The British had a similar experience to the Australians and New Zealanders who landed at ANZAC, Cape Helles. They got off the beaches on the first day. They landed to the south, pushed inland, but were blocked by the Turks, and a whole network of trenches were built up. This is close to the village of Krithia, the famous Krithia vineyard, where the trenches were just like the Western Front, very close together, very narrow, snipers, and night activity and shell fire and rifle grenades and jam tin bombs and all this kind of stuff, and an area of very, very intensive fighting and failed attacks in the summer of 1915 that led to huge casualties, which you see in the cemeteries when you go there today. And we're going to come to the subject of cemeteries later on in this talk. And these are a couple of images showing the trenches in that area around Krithia, with men of the 52nd Lowland Division, which was a Scottish territorial division that that served at Gallipoli in 1915, giving you a kind of an idea of what the trenches were like. Not dissimilar to trenches on the Western Front at that time, same kind of trench design. They were digging into different kind of soil, but there was a parapet at the front, parados at the back, use of sandbags, duck boards, trench revetments, sniping posts, dugouts, all that kind of stuff. It was literally a kind of mirror of what was happening on the Western Front. And these trenches, I mean, this is almost certainly a reserve line, but because the men look slightly more relaxed, but they're still not that far from the Turks. And in the very front line, some of these positions were literally tens of yards apart, and men were able to utilize these jam tin bombs, which were tins of empty plum and apple tickler's jam, where the jam had been eaten by the soldiers or tipped away because it went to liquid in the heat of the Gallipoli sun. And even if you spread it on a hardtack biscuit or an Anzac wafer, as the Australian and New Zealanders called it, the flies would descend and you'd have a fly sandwich. And you definitely wouldn't want to eat that, because the flies had been feasting on corpses and you'd have dysentery in about 5 seconds flat. But the tins were used to put explosive charge in it with a little wick fuse and then lob that at the enemy. And they were so close together they could do that. You had to make sure that you shortened the wick enough so it didn't go off in your hand when you lit it and threw it. But you didn't want to put too long a wick on there, because if the jam tin bomb went through the air and landed in the enemy trenches and it was still burning, they would simply pick it up and throw it back, which of course is not the kind of result that you wanted. And this is from a stereoscope image. There's very few stereoscope images of Gallipoli. And this is one of them, showing a British trench somewhere at Cape Helles with a very elderly, ordinary soldier on the left-hand side. What kind of age he was, I don't know. But the caption of it is just British trenches, Gallipoli. So it's an interesting kind of image showing, again, not untypical trenches in that part of the Gallipoli battlefields. But men were wounded in great numbers in many of these battles, or just by holding the line. My great uncle also ended up at Gallipoli. Two of my great uncles, in fact, with the Essex Regiment. And one of them, my uncle Dan, was shot through the elbow by a Turkish sniper while he was drinking a enamelled mug of tea in the Krithia vineyard in 1915. And he ended up at Mudros. I'm sure he'd like to have come here, because this image was taken at Malta, in one of the main British hospitals there during the Gallipoli campaign. And those are 4 wounded veterans of Gallipoli with a British Army nurse in front, Sister Hobbs. Sergeant Blake on the left of the 1st Essex. I think it's Private Skinner of the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers. I'm guessing that he could well have been one of those. He was in that original landing at W Beach. Private Tom, I think it is, of the RAMC. And a Sergeant Folly of the 2nd, 3rd London Regiment Royal Fusiliers. They were a territorial battalion that had been on Malta actually at the beginning of the war, and then were sent to Gallipoli as reinforcements later on in the campaign, attached to the British 29th Division. So here we're looking into the faces of 4 men who've just come back from the hell of Gallipoli, wounded or sick at Gallipoli, and then ended up on Malta for treatment. And there are war graves on Malta today with the dead of Gallipoli, men who died of their wounds or died of sickness received in the campaign there. So the war at Gallipoli, the campaign at Gallipoli, was not going well by the summer of 1915. It was, as we've said, this mirror of the Western Front, static trench warfare. So an attempt to try and bypass the Turks, bypass the defences with the ANZACs pinned in at ANZAC Cove, land at Suvla Bay to the north. And this is one of 2 official history maps showing the area of Suvla, with the Salt Lake to the north of this map, top of this map, showing the trenches that were subsequently constructed here. And this is the northern part where there's a very steep escarpment, where you can get spectacular views across this from looking down into the Salt Lake. And this is where British units landed. The first men of Kitchener's army to go into action in the Great War against an enemy was not on the Western Front, not at the Battle of Loos, and certainly not on the first day of the Somme. It was here at Gallipoli on the in August, early August 1915, when units from the 13th Western Division, the 11th Northern Division, Kitchener battalions, men of Kitchener's army, the first 100,000 landed on the beaches of Suvla Bay and went into action, the first Kitchener's men to go into action in the Great War. And there's some very, very good books about some of those units. Also, Irish soldiers from the 10th Irish Division were amongst them. And there's a really good book on one of the Dublin Fusilier battalions, called something like With the Pals at Suvla Bay. And this was a really significant moment for the British Army, the deployment of Kitchener's soldiers onto a battlefield. But despite having fresh troops, despite having a lot of dismounted yeomanry units that were landed here, Westminster Dragoons, City of London yeomanry, kind of examples of that, the landings here were a failure. The lack of urgency, the lack of moving inland, again, lack of communication, the lack of moving up reinforcements meant that the Turks got the upper hand once more and blocked us in, and another system of trenches were built that remained static as the summer moved towards the autumn, despite attacks on some of the high ground around Chinook Bear, when units who'd landed at Suvla moved up alongside the New Zealanders and got up onto the top. But the Turks attacked with this almost like a human wave. And in one of those assaults, Mustafa Kemal, who would be the post-war leader of Turkey, led the men from his regiment into an attack when he got struck in the chest by either a British or New Zealand bullet that almost killed him, but he was saved by his watch. And that took the impact of the bullet, and that watch is on display in one of the museums not far or close to Gallipoli, the watch that saved his life. So the campaign was rapidly turning into complete static warfare, and a decision was made with a change of command, Sir Ian Hamilton being the original commander replaced, and it was realised that the campaign was not going to succeed in any way, and that would lead to an evacuation of the northern area of Suvla and Anzac as the winter of 1915 moved on, and then finally at Cape Helles in January of 1916 when the last British troops left. And the only thing that they kind of did right in the entire Gallipoli campaign was the evacuation, coming up with all kinds of devices with rifles that could be fired, with moving water from one mess tin into another through a hole in it that would drip, drip, drip away until the next mess tin would fill with water, and that would pull the trigger of a rifle that had been put into a frame, and it would fire, giving the Turks the idea that the British were still there, still firing away. And they crept away at night and got away, and the force was evacuated, leaving a huge amount of military equipment behind. The Turks rolled up and subsequently did use in different shapes and forms. And the Gallipoli campaign came to an end, as we've said, with 220,000 casualties. So I'm just trying to get the maps to move. So looking at that from an image point of view, there were no official photographers at Gallipoli. There were some that their images subsequently were kind of given or sold to the War Office, but there were a lot of private photographers that took very good cameras because there was no restrictions on them at this stage, certainly not at Gallipoli, and they took really good images. So this is a shot taken from Walker's Ridge near the positions with Chinook Bear kind of behind them to the right from where they are at the minute, looking down towards Suvla, and you can see the escarpment of that ridge line on the northern part of the battlefield there in the distance. And this is, again, these were kind of souvenir postcards that a lot of veterans seem to have bought. And this is one from the same series. I don't know how many there were in this series. This shows rough country looking towards Suvla Bay from the apex ANZAC 1915. And we can see how that precarious many of these kind of positions were on the Anzac and Cape Helles battlefield, kind of perched on the side of these ravines and valleys and waddies and gullies and escarpments and everything else. Now, one of the units that landed at Suvla Bay was the 1st 4th Battalion of the Royal Sussex Regiment. And as you know from the podcast, I'm a Sussex boy. I grew up in Sussex. And I've got a lot of photographs, postcards, private images of the 1st 4th Royal Sussex. They landed at Suvla Bay, which the local papers misspelt and called Silver Bay. And there was a lot of accounts of guys in there. And these are men from the 1st 4th who would have landed at Suvla in August 1915 in training just before the war at one of their annual camps. I think the last annual camp at Arundel Park in Sussex before the war broke out. So they were men who were on the western side of Sussex. So this was kind of Crawley, where I grew up. There was a company from Crawley, Horsham, and then down towards Worthing and across to Bognor and Chichester. And this image shows men from the Chichester Company in the back garden of one of the houses in the centre, somewhere in the centre of Chichester, sometime in late 1914, early 1915, getting prepared for war. It could even be on the actual mobilization of the unit in August 1914, because we see quite a few men standing there in civvies who either have forgotten their uniform or haven't been given a uniform yet as they've rejoined the local company at the drill hall. So again, these are all men who went on to become Gallipoli veterans. This was their first battle, not their last. They go right through the Gallipoli campaign, and they were typical of many of the units that served at Suvla, in that they had very few battle casualties, but by the end of the campaign had lost 80% or more of their effectives from sickness, with water that wasn't safe to drink that resulted in dysentery, the flies that got in your mouth when you were eating, and that led to the spread of sickness and disease. Many of these Sussex lads replicating the whole kind of experience of the units that were there, whether from the Western Division or the Northern Division or from the Irish Division or the dismounted yeomanry cavalry units. Very high proportions of sickness from just serving at Gallipoli, not fighting the enemy, not attacking the enemy, just doing your turn in the trenches there and getting sick in the process. So many of these lads would have suffered that fate, and quite a few of them who died of sickness are buried at Pieta Cemetery at Malta, at Mudros, and also in Egypt as well, which was the evacuation route for casualties. So that's the kind of local connection for me, and these are the kind of Sussex men of Gallipoli. Now, this next little collection of photographs is taken by one or more men in the 42nd East Lancs Division. So they were Lancashire Territorial Division, and they had a lot of Lancashire Fusilier and Manchester Regiment Territorial battalions in them. And they were actually the first territorial division to go on active service in the Great War. They were sent across to Egypt in late 1914. There was no fighting going on there, but they were on overseas. They were overseas duty. They relieved regular battalions that were in Egypt, and they served there. And they were one of those that was selected by the War Office to go to Gallipoli, particularly in the Manchester battalions and some of the Lancashire Fusilier battalions. There were quite a lot of middle-class lads who had a bit of money, and they took cameras with them. And it's, when you collect private images of Gallipoli, the largest number are from men who served in this division, either in a Manchester regiment or in the Lancashire Fusiliers. So I don't know which of those units or even the name of the photographer that took these images, but these are all shots taken by men from that division. So this is looking into V Beach. The high ground in the distance there is where the Hellas Memorial to the Missing is located today, and that is the SS River Clyde on the right there, looking towards where the V Beach landing and the River Clyde landing took place. This ship that was kind of like a Trojan horse, packed full of soldiers from the Munster Fusiliers and the Hampshire Regiment, and the little kind of jetties went down as it hit the shore, grounded on the beach, and they came under murderous fire. Multiple Victoria Crosses awarded for bravery here, and the V Beach cemeteries on the beach. But it sat there for the rest of the campaign, and it sat there and sat there. It was eventually refloated. It became a ship again later on and was scrapped, I think, in the 50s, offered to Britain at the time as a kind of war trophy. But it wasn't accepted, and the ship was scrapped, much to the annoyance of the veterans of the Gallipoli Association at the time. So this is a shot almost certainly taken from either a lighter coming in to bring in a reinforcement draft, or from the deck of a ship looking out from the water up towards the shore. This is another shot taken later on by another guy in this Lancashire Fusiliers or the Manchester Regiment, looking at the River Clyde side on. Quite a sizable ship, kind of became a symbol of Gallipoli. And I joined the Gallipoli Association in the 1980s. I discovered that there was a Gallipoli veteran called Edgar Banner who lived not far from me. He'd also served in Salonika. So I went to see him, and he was then the chairman, I think, of the Gallipoli Association. So he asked me to join as an associate member. You could only be a full member if you were a veteran of the Gallipoli campaign, and most of the members of it were. And they published a little kind of members handbook that listed, you couldn't do it these days with GDPR and so on, but they published this little booklet that listed all of the members and where they lived. So for me, tracking down veterans, this is great. So I went through it and went off and interviewed a few more Gallipoli veterans who were living in Sussex at the time. So it became a symbol of it, and it was the symbol used on the cover of the Gallipolian, which was the journal of the Gallipoli Association. And it's still going. One of my old school chums, Stephen Chambers, who some of you know, he's now involved in it, and you'll find Stephen on Twitter and the Gallipoli Association on Twitter, and it's well worth kind of joining. Another photograph taken of the area around Cape Helles. So the 42nd East Lancs Division served very extensively in the Gully Ravine and the Crithea sectors on Cape Helles. So these images kind of relate to that. And this is the entrance to Gully Ravine. And very little today has changed. That terraced area on the left-hand side there, you can see the indents of most of those positions, the sangars and the dugouts and the toilets and the ammunition stores and everything else. It's kind of all there. And there's a well at this entrance to the ravine as well, often referred to as Joe Murray's well. Joe Murray was a member of the Royal Naval Division, wrote a very good book, Gallipoli 1915, and was another veteran that I interviewed. A friend of mine's father was in a care home in Dorking and rang me up and said, "Oh, there's a First World War veteran who wrote a famous book in this care home. You should come and see him." And she didn't know who he was. And when I turned up there and discovered it was Joe Murray, that was really quite something. So Joe Murray describes in one of his books drawing water out of this well. So to visitors to Gallipoli today, you'll see Stephen Chambers, who's written several books on Gallipoli, Peter Hart, you'll be familiar with his books. They often talk about Joe Murray's well, and it's still there. Sadly, you can't quite see it in this photograph, but it is there. It's not as clear in Gully Ravine as you see it here, because it's clear because of the passage of thousands of men going up and down it. But at the far end of the gully was the front lines. So this was kind of like a massive natural communication trench that took men from the beach up towards the front line on Cape Helles at the other end of Gully Ravine. This is taken from one of the bluffs looking down onto W Beach, Lancashire Landing. And this is where we saw the illustration of the Lancashire Fusiliers landing here. This is the kind of view of the beach that the Turks would have had when they landed. So you imagine the Lancashire Fusiliers coming in with my grandfather in one of these boats going from left to right towards this beach, and you're up there with Turkish rifle teams and machine guns. It was said that they had pom-poms up there as well. There's been a lot of Turkish research on this, saying that the British kind of exaggerated the amount of firepower that the Turks had because of the tremendous kind of kicking that the Lancashire Fusiliers had. But whatever, any kind of weapons with this kind of field of fire, this kind of view, is going to be you're going to receive a lot of punishment. And this gives you kind of a view into the Turkish perspective of defending a beach like this. But this is later on, when this has become a position behind the British front line up towards Krithia, when this is a main route in for troops, for reinforcements, for the evacuation of wounded. You can see they've built piers there to facilitate supplies being brought in and men being taken off. There are tents, there are positions, there are dugouts. And again, a lot of this is still there to this day. And the track that goes off to the right beyond the tents today takes you up to the Lancashire Landing Cemetery, which is kind of in the shadow, as it were, of the Hellas Memorial. And this is a close-up of a typical kind of Sanger stroke position stroke dugout on the side of either Gully Ravine or W Beach or any of the kind of British and Australian beaches. It was a kind of ramshackle army in terms of the way they looked. They went in with their full kit and their uniforms, but they kind of lived in very different conditions. And if you look at the images of soldiers, they're often in shirt sleeves. They've cut their trousers down to make them into shorts. They're wearing, there was no, the Australians had slouch hats, which gave some protection from the sun. British soldiers didn't have them. So you often see them making kind of a bit of material that goes around the back of their service dress cap to protect the back of their neck. There was a fitment, I think, added later on that could be used, but I don't think they were issued in any significant numbers for Gallipoli. So they kind of have a very different look to them as active service soldiers compared to the men on the Western Front, who are slightly more regimented to a degree in their appearance. And I think it's all part of kind of what the experience of Gallipoli was for these men. And of course, with a campaign that failed, that's a series of pictures of the kind of rear echelon of the 42nd Division. This is from the same collection, and it's almost certainly Lancashire Landing Cemetery, where there is a large number of men from the 42nd Division buried in there. And these are British graves from the period. So this is a photograph, I believe, taken during the Gallipoli campaign, showing what a typical cemetery looked like, with kind of rough and ready crosses. And this is what, of course, was left behind, but it's not what was discovered when British soldiers went back there in 1919, which we'll come to shortly. And this is on the beach there, one of the lighters that was used, just kind of left and abandoned. And a lot of this kind of kit was then subsequently left behind. And when you go there today, on the shore of Gallipoli and just off the shore itself in the sea, there are a lot of these wrecks. There are companies now that do diving tours of Gallipoli, where you can dive at Suvla and dive at Cape Helles to see the wrecks. And again, one of the things that John Ace Fisher filmed for the Gallipoli program we did, Gallipoli the First D-Day, was a Turkish guy, Savaş, who dived on some of the wrecks there and just finds incredible kind of material in them. This is in the same collection. It does say on the back of it that it's Gallipoli. I've never seen those quite significant piers there. I've never seen that. Personally, I think this is probably more likely Mudros, and these are loading piers for lighters or ships that are then going to take supplies over to Gallipoli itself. But nevertheless, it's a fantastic kind of private photograph showing soldiers taking their horses down to the sea and riding around naked and swimming in the sea, and the kind of infrastructure of war is just behind them. It kind of looks like a jolly day out on the beach, but the ever presence of war is there. But with the campaign over, Britain, France, the Empire nations withdraw, and they leave their dead behind and don't return until 1919. And when they do return, this is kind of what they find. They find that many of the cemeteries have been desecrated by the Turks, who have been told that British, Australian, and possibly French graves have grave goods buried in them. And the average Turkish soldier is incredibly poor. He thinks, well, the dead don't need whatever grave goods they've got in there. My family could do with that. I could do with that. So a lot of cemeteries were dug up and desecrated to an extent. And when the British came back in 1919, they found the whole battlefield covered in skulls and bones, and cemeteries not in the state that they'd been left. Understandably, we were the invaders, and the Turks took great exception to that, as you can imagine. But they also found, obviously, a huge amount of Turkish dead that was left buried out on the battlefield. The Turks didn't build many cemeteries during the campaign itself. The cemeteries that are there today have been built subsequently, and some of them I don't even believe contain any human remains. They're kind of symbolic, because the vast amount of Turkish dead were kind of like this. A lot of British dead, but also Turkish dead. And again, in the kind of early 2000s, going to Gallipoli, there were quite a few places where you could kind of walk off the path, and there were skulls still in the bushes where they'd still not been cleared up from the fighting there in 1915. And it meant that while a lot of men had been buried, the graves were lost, the markers on the graves were destroyed, and they were unknowns, or there was these fragmentary remains like this scattered right across the Gallipoli battlefields from Cape Helles to Anzac to Suvla. So it has a very, very high proportion of missing, the Gallipoli campaign, from a British and Commonwealth perspective. But cemeteries were still there, and chaplains were interviewed because they buried a lot of the dead. Who was buried here? Who was buried there? We've got this kind of cross with half a name on it. Do you remember anything about it? So some men were properly identified. This is Shrapnel Valley Cemetery at Anzac, showing naval personnel, Royal Naval personnel, helping to reconstitute the cemetery after the war. With the war over, British troops, naval troops, came back in 1919. The British occupied Chinakilly, just up the road, in the 1920s. My other grandfather, who was a soldier in the Royal Army Medical Corps, then served at Chinakilly, and he came to Gallipoli, and he worked on these cemeteries, the construction of these cemeteries in the early 1920s. And this is kind of from that period, showing how they reconstituted them. And a decision was then made to, rather than replace these wooden crosses with the kind of headstones that were going to be used on the Western Front and other theatres of war, they would use what were called Dutch stalls, which are kind of small headstones laid at an angle and laid flat, and that the graves of unknown soldiers would not be marked. So when you go, and I think I've spoken about this in the podcast, when you go to the Farm Cemetery, for example, which has got several hundred casualties buried in it, there's only a handful of headstones. And I've taken people walking down there on leisure trips when we've got there, and they've said, "Is that it?" They kind of get there and there's like 7 or 8 headstones. Is that it? We come all this way down this mule track and you've nearly killed us. And is that it? Well, actually, there's kind of quite a few hundred others buried here, but their graves are not marked. But this is a kind of what they were trying to achieve by reconstituting these cemeteries after the war. And this is Aribanu Cemetery looking up Anzac, this part of Anzac. That's looking up towards Chunuk Bair. You can the Sphinx slightly out of view to the right. And there's a base camp beyond that sunken ship on the far side of the shore there, which is actually the Imperial War Graves Commission base camp, which is still a base camp to this day, where the commission has its on-site headquarters at Gallipoli. And I don't know if you can still do it now, but in my very first visits to Gallipoli, that's where we stayed. They had this kind of imperial hut that I think was built in the kind of 50s, which had no electricity, had gas lights and a gas fridge and a gas shower, but you could rent it from the commission and stay right on the battlefields, and that was really quite an extraordinary kind of experience to do that. But this again shows a kind of typical cemetery at the when the British, the Australians returned to make these cemeteries permanent, and gradually they were transformed into actual Imperial War Graves Commission permanent cemetery site. So we saw Shrapnel Valley just as crosses, and this is during the transformation phase. This is part of a series of images that were published in the 1920s. And I don't know whether they did one for every cemetery. There's more than 30 cemeteries at Gallipoli, but I've seen about half a dozen different ones. This is Shrapnel Valley. There was no cross of sacrifice as such placed in these cemeteries. There was a variation on it. It was a structure, a wall with a cross symbol on it, because it's a Muslim country, and it was felt to respect that religion that you could have religious symbolism, but to put a cross with a crusader sword in the middle of a cemetery here was considered to be an insult to the nation, so it was decided not to do that here. And this is just prior to these graves being replaced with these Dutch stalls, which you can possibly just about see in this #2 Outpost New Zealand Cemetery at ANZAC photograph, again from the same period. Here the crosses have been replaced and the little kind of stubby headstones are in place in the cemeteries. And I think that over the years that I've been going there, I like to think that I've almost looked at every single headstone at Gallipoli, and there's a much, much higher proportion of private inscriptions on them, partly because there's a lot of Australian casualties here and their government's paid for it. New Zealand graves, their government would refuse personal inscriptions because they felt if one family couldn't have it, then none of them should. So you're not going to see inscriptions on those headstones. But amongst the British ones where there was a payment involved, there's a much higher percentage. And perhaps it's because they were so far away that families felt they had to mark it somehow. And some of those inscriptions on these graves at Gallipoli, they really are incredible. And something I've spoken about to a certain degree in the podcast when I did an episode on Gallipoli cemeteries. So just to kind of finish up, I just want to show you a kind of whiz through, because I'm mindful of the fact I've been talking for almost an hour now. But I wanted to show you this, one of the little collections I've got from a particular unit. And again, I don't know the name of the photographer, but this is a little pocket album of photographs taken by an officer of the 1st 5th Battalion Royal Scots, the Edinburgh Rifles, who were attached to the 29th Division, what became known as the Immortal 29th at Gallipoli. This is them in Egypt, the commanding officer and some of the officers of the unit assembling for a route march. And this is in their camp at Alexandria before they moved off to take part in the Gallipoli campaign. And then he went on to take, with a private camera, a little kind of Kodak camera, a whole series of images. Now, there was later on there was restriction with cameras, but at Gallipoli there was none. So these kind of collections are not uncommon. But they give us a fascinating kind of insight into a period of the war when there were no official photographers. And once you got to Gallipoli, the images are very faded, which kind of, I think, gives you an insight just to how bright it was. And these early kind of very raw photography, the actual images and the negatives could be affected by the actual conditions if you weren't really sure what you were doing. So I've fiddled around with these to kind of make them a little bit more visible, but it gives you an idea. So there's no captions to any of these, and there's no names on them to identify anybody, except the guy there could even be an officer. I mean, I spoke about them being kind of ramshackle army. Most of the guys that he takes photographs of are officers, but this is a dugout somewhere on Cape Helles, one of their company positions. This is some of the sangers positions used by the men. That's got probably the battalion cookers in there. You can see the big old Dixies that food went up in. Making food at Gallipoli was a really kind of difficult prospect for these men. And perhaps the army doesn't always have a lot of sympathy for army cooks, often referred to as the enemy from within. But here their task was an unenviable one in terms of trying to cook food with a huge amount of flies, because with failed attacks, bodies in no man's land, then there must have been billions of flies at Gallipoli in 1915, which got into the food and then spread disease. There's quite a few images in this album of them doing kind of works. This is an officer overseeing the men working on a trackway, probably leading to one of the gullies. This battalion moved from Cape Helles up to ANZAC to be near the Australians. Later on in the campaign, some of these images come from that. This is almost certainly a post in one of the gullies. They might actually be Australians in that image, because I say they're kind of alongside the Australians in that period, or they could even be New Zealanders. You see the kind of headgear, the lemon squeezes that the New Zealanders had rather. You see those in evidence. You also see casualties leaving equipment behind and men picking up slouch hats and other hats just to give them some kind of protection from the sun. So you can't always identify the nationality of a soldier by the kit that he's wearing, because the variations in kit at Gallipoli were just immense. And this is a very important kind of aspect of the Gallipoli campaign. And these are water bowsers, and this is a supply of fresh water. Most fresh water had to be shipped in. The water that was on site was largely polluted. And so ships would come in with petrol tins, hundreds, if not thousands of petrol tins full of water that had been shipped over from some of the Aegean islands like Mudros. or even further afield than that, to be brought in and dished out to the men in the campaign. This looks like it's kind of got a well in the middle there, and they're actually pumping water out of something. But this water was not the best kind of water, and also led to all kinds of problems with disease there. This is somewhere. This is on ANZAC, kind of the terrain there. Kind of spells that out. And this is one of the gullies leading up towards the front line. And this is supplies going up on mules. And there's quite a few images of Indian troops. You can see an Indian soldier in the foreground of this photograph. And this is a picture he took of a British Indian Army officer giving out orders to Indian troops who were alongside them. There were Indian fighting troops there. There were Gurkhas at Gallipoli. We saw that painting at the very beginning, but also quite a large number of Indian labourers at Gallipoli. And not just Indians, Macedonian Mule Corps was there as well. For example, there was Zion Mule Corps. So these were Jewish soldiers that were recruited into a labouring unit. So again, this is kind of all evidence of how much investment the British kind of gave in the importance of labour to enable your troops to be supplied and delivered with those supplies on the battlefield. So there are quite a few others in that collection, but that's kind of some of the better ones. I thought we'd end with this. This is a post-war. This is ANZAC Day 1923. This was the first major occurrence in which veterans went back. People from Australia and New Zealand went back, and the troops in the foreground here are almost certainly British troops that are from the Çanakkale garrison, which the British are kind of occupying that part of Turkey just up the road, who've come down to be part of this or see what it's all about. And there was a lot of calls in Australia in the interwar period for a kind of a British Legion Great Pilgrimage style pilgrimage to Gallipoli. It never really truly happened. And this was the kind of one major occasion in which there was a significant number of people there. From New Zealand, people only went in kind of small groups to attend ceremonies there for the Chunk Bear Memorial and things like that. But there was not a national pilgrimage. There was a kind of a small scale British pilgrimage in the 1920s, I believe, but it's something that I don't know enough about, and there's not been enough research on, and probably is worthy of at least a PhD, if not a few books. But I hope what that's done is kind of on this Anzac Day, on this commemoration of the Gallipoli landings, the involvement of not just Australian and New Zealand, but British troops and French. French are the kind of missing element of this. I've never ever acquired a kind of French album of Gallipoli. I would dearly love one, but it's something that I don't have, so I've not been able to show you any kind of the French images there. But they were a very, very important part of it, and it's worth remembering that more French soldiers died at Gallipoli than Australians, so their presence was not a small one in any shape or form. But it is something that even within France is not really kind of even known about. So very few people will be commemorating Gallipoli today in France, even though French troops were involved and were killed on this day. So I hope those kind of glimpse into Gallipoli through unpublished images and through photographs of people who were actually there has kind of given you a little bit more perspective on the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. So that's where I'm going to stop sharing.